road. And the sentiment of the song certainly kind of describes how we're all living in 2020. And most of us are anxious for 2021 to roll around in anticipation of a smoother road, some solutions that can reflect that we've been victorious in our battle against the COVID-19 pandemic, and also the pandemic that I call the pandemic of 1619, the question of racial and social justice in America, both converging in ways that we've never experienced before. I'm pleased today to have Senator Melissa Franson, who represents District 59, is a DFLer on the call, along with Steve Grove. Commissioner Steve Grove heads the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development. And I want to thank them for being here to talk to you, to us, about the important vision and work they represent in addressing COVID-19 in our community. We're also pleased to have my co-host, Carmen Robles. Carmen and I do a version of this program called Conversaciones con el McFarlane y Carmen Robles, in which we try to connect in English and in Spanish. Also on the call is editor and writer for Insight News, Brenda Lyle Gray. Let me begin also by thanking Minnesota Department of Health for underwriting this series of daily conversations. Our intent is to bring knowledge, confidence, awareness to our communities about what's happening in the state of Minnesota with individuals, with agencies and organizations, with government units, and with businesses that are all working together to address COVID-19. Senator, let me start with you. Just a statement, if you would, about the status of our community and our government's response to COVID-19. You've been at the front level, from the front line, from the very beginning in crafting policy and solutions. Good afternoon and welcome.
Well, thank you, Alan. Thank you for convening us. I think this is such an important venue for us to be together, right, with community. A lot of times we speak to community, but we have to be part of the community to be heard, right? To be part of that conversation. And I love how you started the program, because I grew up in Puerto Rico and I love my reggae. And I've seen the Wailers in Puerto Rico opening for B.B. King. So that was my fond memories of music, and music is the unifier, right? And in a pandemic like this, there's a lot that unites us, right? We're all fighting the same fight. Whether it's in the commissioner's office and helping small businesses, or whether it's in the Senate trying to really come together as a legislature to pass relief for businesses and families, because we're all struggling, and this pandemic has touched us all. So I'm proud that we just recently passed in our last special session of the 7th special session, a package to also extend unemployment benefits and to provide some more relief for families to be able to, make it through until we get back to a new normal. And the vaccine is just around the corner. In a few more months, hopefully a lot of Minnesotans will be able to access the vaccine, starting with first frontline workers and healthcare workers and people who are critical to our economy. We all are, but in terms of being organized and getting this vaccine out, we're seeing from our medical providers in the front line, the heroes that have been helping those systems to move forward. And frankly, I have a 5 and a 4-year-old, and I know the commissioner has young kids too. And we're crazy to have them back in school and to be safe there. So we want to make sure that our teachers are protected. So it really takes community. So I'm excited that we were able to pass that on a bipartisan level a week ago, and that it's moving forward. And now this week we just heard about the federal government passing their own package. So it goes hand in hand. We need partners at the federal level, at the local level, and at grassroots level as well. So thank you for having us.
Well, I want to commend you and the governor and the governor's executive team that jumped in when this thing emerged back in the spring, and ask you to take a minute to sort of review how this administration, and I believe properly and aggressively, responded to protect the interest of the residents of Minnesota, and the businesses in Minnesota that were affected by the COVID-19. And I just think back to some wonderful conversations we had as part of a media group. I helped convene Black, Asian, Latino, Native American media to be present in meetings with you and the governor's executive team and the Department of Health to talk about how assets in community ought to be engaged. And that is exactly what has happened thanks to you and the governor's team. But talk about how this thing emerged. Give us a look back to where we are now, if you don't mind.
Well, there's a lot that has been happening in the last, well, since March or even earlier when we were talking about this pandemic starting to be actually a pandemic and hitting all parts of our globe. But I know that Minnesota has always been a leader, and being in the legislature, this is my 8th year. I'm going on my 3rd term. I've never seen us really step up to a plate so quickly. And one example is what we did for childcare. That was an area that I worked on, that early on we stepped up to this as a state to provide emergency grants for childcare, because again, we recognized that we needed our healthcare system to be strong, and the foundation is to making sure that families can be able to send their kids to a place that they're safe, and those first responders and those first critical essential workers. And that was something that we did early on, that other states looked at us and applauded us, and we were again at the forefront of providing some of that relief. Obviously, and I'll let the commissioner talk about our wonderful unemployment insurance program, which was a great program that was one of the models in the country as well. But I'll let him loud about that. But that was another improvement and piece of the puzzle that we were able to deploy really quickly. I'm a small business owner myself. I'm a lawyer as well, and I understand the complexities of small businesses. They're not all created equally. I've worked in corporate as well. And I understand that some corporations are able to withstand some storms, but not as easily as the small businesses, the mom and pop shops. So we've been trying to reach out and really understand. In my district, I represent Edina, Bloomington, Eden Prairie, Minnetonka, but I also have a business in Minneapolis in the uptown area that was also the area that was devastated by some of the George Floyd, demonstrations. So we have a lot of work to do here, but Minnesota's still moving forward with the relief that we passed, and we had a budget surplus, and we also had a reserve that we were able to tap into. And the economy is still fragile, but I think we are in the best shape that we can be in this circumstance to withstand this storm and get out of it stronger. So I've applauded a lot of the relief that the governor has done. It's not all been perfect for everybody. I understand that. I've received plenty of emails of people and phone calls of people who have been impacted by the closures and the executive orders, but we need leadership. And I think this governor and this administration has shown that in a lot of ways.
Thank you, Steve Grove. Thank you for being here as well. You are leader of the state's principal workforce and economic development agency, and what you bring to that position, years of experience in technology. You were at Google, I think, for a number of years, and I think everybody was expecting, and you've been delivering on how to use the learning, the wisdom of your management experience at Google in making technology one of the things that worked best for Minnesota. What are you doing at DEED, Department of Employment and Economic Development, to directly impact COVID-19, the state's response, and to support the citizens of our state?
Well, thanks, Al, and Senator friends, and it's a pleasure to be on this program with you as well. It has been an unprecedented year, and what Minnesotans should expect out of their economic development agency is a department that's going to take care of people when they're at their most challenging times. And the very first step in all of that has been unemployment insurance. We have paid out over $9 billion into the Minnesota economy this year through our unemployment insurance payments. And we're fortunate in this state to have one of the best programs in the country. It's been taking years of investment, far predates my time in this office. But you see these pictures around the country of people standing in line or filling out applications on paper. We just haven't had that challenge in our state, in large part due to the technology infrastructure of that platform and the fact that it just works. But there are over 800,000 Minnesotans who have gotten at least one check from our unemployment insurance program since this all began. And let's be clear, this has not affected all Minnesotans in the same way. This has been a very targeted economic crisis, right? Not only in terms of the industries that is affected, the hospitality industry, those types of businesses where people convene and come together, given the nature of the virus. But also demographically, we know that over 60% of all the Black labor force in our state has applied for unemployment insurance since this has begun. 52% of Native Americans in our state have applied for unemployment insurance since this has all begun. Whites, the number's more like down in the 20s. And so this has been a well discussed and documented trend, but it always bears repeating that the effects of this pandemic have not been equal. And so our response should not be equal as well. And so in addition to making sure unemployment insurance just works, we have passed a series of small business programs to assist the smaller companies that really face the most challenges. And in each of those packages, targeted some spending on targeted communities, cultural malls that exist across the state, businesses owned by BIPOC entrepreneurs, making sure that the money goes where it's needed most. It's never enough at the state level. When recessions like this happen, the federal government really is the one that has the biggest amount of power to make change. But state government has responded and done it as best as it possibly can. And I think, the other component of this is trying to make the best decisions on what parts of the economy to keep open and what parts of the economy are inherently unsafe given the science of this disease. And those are some of the hardest decisions that our governor has had to make, and that myself and Commissioner Malcolm and others have had to advise him on, because real lives are held in the balance, and you can't just look at things through a public health lens or just look at things through the lens of the economy. You've got to balance both of those things. And, we were certainly hopeful that the virus would wane at the end of this summer and we'd be in a different place, but we are now in a more dangerous place. The most recent restrictions, I think, have put us in a better trend line, but that's going to be a continual challenge until that vaccine gets out there. We're going to have to make sure we're taking care of people and talking to community as we go. So it's been a pretty holistic effort.
As you analyze the data, thank you for those important statistics. 60% of the African-American workforce has applied for benefits. What does it mean? How do you interpret that phenomenon? Does it mean that these jobs were lost first? Is it part of the adage we've always said in the Black community, last hired, first fired? And maybe this is not a question of firing, but last hired, first impacted. Explain what that means, Commissioner, and maybe Senator, you weigh in on that as well. And as you explain that, what does the path forward mean? What are we learning as a society, as a state, to structurally impact different outcomes, better outcomes for all Minnesotans for the future? I think we're leaning in to some marvelous opportunity, but what's your assessment of that? Commissioner first.
Yeah, I mean, the pure data on this would tell us part of the reason that people of color have been hit hardest economically is that they over-index in industries that have a front-facing component to it. In other words, those frontline jobs are more often populated by people of color than others. But to just say that's the only reason would not be an honest take of the situation. There is systematic racism in our society, and Minnesota has seen that this year more than any other state. And we think this is a moment to really make an inflection point in our state's economy and change that narrative and change that reality. And that's going to take some much deeper soul searching than just saying, let's get a vaccine in people's arms and be done with it, right? That's going to take a much more thoughtful and systematic look at how we structure our systems. I can tell you at our department, we have made it a goal that every single program that we run, and primarily our programs put money into the economy to help it grow, every one of those programs will have equity benchmarks that are much, much higher than they've been in the past. We will hold ourselves accountable to putting money that starts with equity and ends with equity as a primary principle, because that's not only what's needed for our state and for justice, but it's also the right economic decision. 70% of the population growth in this state over the next 10 years is going to come from people of color. So we've got to be thinking much more holistically about this and look at those systemic issues and challenges. And I say this as a white man running this department. I've got to spend time listening every single day to the stories of my friends and partners in community on this topic, because we're not going to get it right unless we don't.
When Carmen Robles and I first met 20, 30 years ago, I'm not sure when it was, Carmen, but we came together on a project that Insight News was doing, and it was called the Ethnic Heritage Series. And one of these quarterly publications dealt with the emerging Latino publication Latino population in Minnesota. And through that, Carmen has helped me to both identify and more reveal my own Afro-Latino heritage and roots, because I've always walked, and I still walk, in the spirit of being an African American. I call myself a New World African, but I'm more than that. I'm also Jamaican, Jamaican. I'm also Cuban, and so there's a world of contact and context that reside in me. And Senator, we were saying before the program that all of our communities, particularly the emerging people of color communities, have deep and expansive roots to home town communities wherever we are. Could be San Juan, could be Kingston, could be Havana, could be Harare. And our proposition is to present these connections as assets, not as liabilities, as tools we use to develop vitality and resilience in our society. What do you think about that? And how do you see policy developing to reflect the demographic shift?
Well, I've always seen it as we're all interconnected, and the pandemic, again, we realized who's an essential worker. If you look at those numbers, which I don't have in front of me, a large majority of those are people of color who are propping up our economy, who are picking up the vegetables and fruits. A lot of them are Hispanic, Latino workers, and a lot of them are undocumented. So this pandemic has unveiled who's really doing all that work, and all the different political implications of all that, of how much we rely on this labor. So I think we're all interconnected, and we all rely on each other in one way, shape, or form. And again, the school piece too is something that's interesting. A lot of people didn't realize how much we relied on school lunches. I mean, we knew it at the legislature. We've been fighting for making sure everyone has access to food regardless, and not have to be shamed that they can't afford it. But now that issue is really real for many, many more families, because of this pandemic has not it's discriminated with everybody, right? In terms of the economy, it's impacted everybody. But in particular, how we relied on food in schools, and mental health services in schools, counselors in schools, technology, broadband, et cetera. So we realized how much more we need to value. I mean, the childcare piece, again, most of those people working in that industry are low wage and mostly women of color. So how do we prop the system up that needs to be stable and strong so we can get out of this stronger? Is something that we can look at with real data, real information, because we all were able to unveil how much we are interconnected. So I think it's not a bad thing, but there's a lot of work to be done in that area, especially when we talk about access to broadband. How kids are supposed to be doing virtual learning when they don't have access to broadband in the middle of Minneapolis or in some places in rural Minnesota. So it's all of us were affected by this. And how do we prop up each other, because we rely on each other?
So, Commissioner, what's on the table right now? The government, the federal government, I think last night or today, is rolling out an agreement of $900 billion. Can you unpack that, kind of explain what it means in general for the country and what it means for Minnesota in particular? And how does that support or stand alongside what you're doing, what we're doing as a state government? And finally, in talking about it, would you speak specifically to the equity proposition you've just outlined? What does that mean in terms of engaging and supporting and growing businesses and services provided by people of color?
Well, thanks, Al. I think, it is good to see Congress finally move. It did take a little longer than I think even they wanted it to take, but it seems as though a deal is here. We have not yet seen the final language of the legislation that was agreed upon, so there'll be more details to come. But in broad strokes, it is a $900 billion package, roughly a third of it going to direct worker supports through unemployment insurance and direct payments to families. Another third of it roughly for small businesses. So about 325 million of that, or billion of that money, goes to small businesses. And within that funding pocket, there are targeted funds for targeted communities, communities of color, business owners of color, and the like. And we'll see those details emerge as this gets further released. But that was the high level that we've seen so far. And then there's some money for Senator Franzen just mentioned broadband. There's $7 billion in it for broadband, specifically $1 billion for broadband on tribal lands. another $700 million for another federal auction for rural broadband. So many of these trends that were emerging before this pandemic on the need for broadband, the pace of automation, the changing nature of work have just accelerated throughout it. And it's impossible to imagine going back to the way things were fully. Even what we're doing now in this sort of video conference like formats, this isn't going away. It will change, of course, but I think we've all discovered some efficiencies we didn't know were there as it relates to the nature of work, and that affects people's jobs too. So one of our big focuses throughout the next year is how do you help the average Minnesota worker who's out there trying to make a living and support their family find a job that has long-term potential in this new economy? And what do those jobs look like? What are the skills needed for those jobs? And how do we help people think about reskilling if that's what's necessary? You have a ton of workers in the hospitality industry who've been separated from their work. And yes, we have a great hospitality industry that will come back in this state, but jobs never come back in the same way and at the same amount as when they leave, especially when there's a major, layoff cliff. So we want to make sure those workers have knowledge of other opportunities. And the reality is there's a lot of firms hiring right now. There are over 100,000 jobs open in Minnesota, many of them in really high paying professions and that don't require a college degree. So there's opportunity in the market. And I think, you speak back to equity, Al, I think we've got to make sure that our state's workforce development funds focus on equity first. For too long, our state's workforce development fund, for example, which is a payroll tax that every employer pays into a bucket of money that my department then helps administer to help people find jobs, has really just kind of helped workers at the same rate that they're represented in the population. But if we see the income gaps that are there today, we should be structuring a fund that is much more modern and that focuses on the challenges of 2020, not the mid 1980s when that fund was created. So we've got to modernize government in a way that delivers on the challenges we face today to get this economy kickstarted, because coming out of this recession, there's going to be states that win and states that lose, and Minnesota's got to be a state that wins.
Let me ask you about your department, Steve. You describe your department, how big it is, how many employees, how much real estate do you have? And I raised the question because I had your colleague, the commissioner of DHS, on the program yesterday, and she talked about how moving their workforce from the office to home has been a significant reshaping of the profile of the organization in terms of its physicality, that there may be 2 or 3 buildings that they occupy now that they no longer will occupy, that, as you just said, they're discovering efficiencies by telework, right? And employees that like it, that do as good a job or better job, and save money because of it, and therefore the state is saving money. But what is the impact of that on the real estate market? How are those buildings being used differently? And so talk about that generally. What's the equation you use to examine all of the components of the solutions that lie ahead of us?
Well, it's a really interestingly timed question, Al, because our department's lease in our current building is up next spring. And so we've been in this process for last year of reevaluating what we do next. And I'll tell you, we were pretty close on a decision earlier this year, and then everything changed. So we've gone back to the drawing board a bit and had a lot of good conversations with space planning experts and trying to navigate how much of the future of work is remote versus how much of it you need to be in person for, because there's those synergies that you get with in-person work, and there's security concerns as well. And we want our downtowns to be vibrant. That's another key component of this, is if everyone just departs the cities immediately, that just instantly changes the dynamic, as we've seen over the past several months. So I tell you, what we have learned is that people do like teleworking much more than we might have thought. Our internal surveys of the department show a broad support for working from home. And I think part of that is given the fact that a lot of parents are doing distance learning, as Senator Franzen mentioned a moment ago. But I think partly it's because of the efficiencies of losing a commute and being able to pace things out differently. So there'll be some combination of in-person work and working from home, I think, in the future. Real estate isn't going away, it's just changing. And I think ultimately what we owe taxpayers is the most efficient use of space possible. If we can save some money here and there with real estate costs moving in the future, given how work is changing so quickly, we should do it, because that money can then go into the services themselves, not into the square footage we're paying to sit there and do the work on. So it is changing really quickly, and we've just got to be smart managers on it.
How big is the organization? How many employees do you have?
We're about 1,400 at Deed, and we're about half of those in St. Paul And then the other half are actually spread out across the state. We have 50 different career force locations across Minnesota. Those are brick and mortar buildings where you can come and get assistance on finding jobs. Increasingly, though, you mentioned technology, we're trying to do this more virtually. And so careerforcemn.com is our website. We post job opportunities there. We do interview coaching. You know, a lot of people are feeling alone and nervous right now because finding a new job is hard, or finding a job at all is hard, but you're not alone. You know, the state has help for you. Careerforcemn.com is a great place to start. We can do any amount of coaching and matching up to jobs. And there is a lot of hiring out there. So we hope those who are looking into that take advantage.
But that goes to the problem that you described, Senator Franson, and that is that there is an unequal access to broadband, to the technology. So some people are sophisticated and able and have access in their home to high-speed broadband and can access the state and other places, and some cannot. And there are communities that don't have the same level of access. Then there are communities that don't have the same level of confidence, the same level of training or awareness, right? And so all these are problems that we have to address. So Senator, that leads to the next question. We'll probably end the conversation on this. What is the hope for moving our community to awareness, to knowledgeable decision-making around the vaccine? I can tell you, and you've heard this, and we see it nationally, Black Americans are voicing hesitation because of lived experience, or because of the stories we've heard about our communities being used as guinea pigs, or not being fully apprised of the meaning of research and assessments, et cetera. So how do we move forward now in a crisis situation to bring confidence, education, awareness, so people can make decisions that are the right decision? I think the right decision is getting the vaccination. I intend to take it as quickly as I can, get it. But I want people to feel comfortable saying that and acting on it. What do you think? What can we do?
Well, Al, you're doing it. You're a trusted community anchor, and we need more of you talking out there, delivering this message to our community, because people listen to you, right? I see the same thing in the Hispanic community. Many communities, for instance, Puerto Rican women were tested on the birth control pill without their knowledge. That's history, that it's part of our background and our hesitancy to trust government. Mm-hmm. But there are more and more people that look like you and me in government that we need to also emulate and share that information. Before this, I was also taping a show that we do with Univision in Spanish, talking. It's called Café Libre, which you're part of. You've worked with us on that too, telling people in Spanish in their native tongue, and bringing people that speak their native tongue from the Department of Health, from healthcare communities like Hennepin Health, telling people the information that they need to know, and also where to find the correct information. It takes time, it takes repetition, like you know, in media. Mm-hmm. But the more we beat that drum, saying that we trust what's coming out and we're going to be part of it, and people see us doing that, I think that's going to go a long ways. But it's going to take time. I think there's going to be hesitancy in communities, whether it's because they've had a bad experience with government, or because they just don't trust government. And we need to break that and get people involved of why this is so important for our public health. One thing that's really exciting is that Minnesota has a great public health program compared to other states. We are really lucky that we have had a really stable public health program across our state. So this we've been looked at as models again to implement the vaccine, the rollout. So again, we just have to keep building on it and make sure that everybody is invited to that particular conversation and particular information about that vaccine. So more of this is what's needed, and I'm thankful for you for inviting us.
Favor de decir lo mismo en español. ¿Puede tomar un minuto más y hablar en español?
Claro.
Lo mismo, por favor.
Claro, rápidamente es más conversaciones así, de hablar de la vacuna, de lo importante que es que el público tome la vacuna, que sean, que puedan confiar en el gobierno en términos de que esta vacuna ha sido probada y sean científicamente aprobada por el gobierno, y en Europa y en Estados Unidos también ha pasado por mucho rigor, y ahora necesitamos que ustedes se tomen la vacuna, y son 2 dosis, y van a tener que hacerlo cuando su empleador le diga que está en turno. Va a tomar tiempo, pero necesitamos que todo el mundo coopere para que todo el mundo tenga la inmunización y podamos seguir adelante de esta pandemia. Estamos juntos en esta lucha para vencer el COVID-19.
¿Qué piensas, Carmen? You're muted. Unmute.
Did I pass?
You did actually, but I wanted Carmen to jump in. Carmen is not.
Here we go.
Mm-hmm.
Muchísimas gracias, senadora. Usted lo dijo, pero bellamente. She said exactly what we need to hear, and that is to see people we trust giving us information. When the senator speaks to the constituents en español, we trust. Entonces, we don't trust, regular TV and regular media. And so I think this is the most important part of this program with the podcast this month, speaking with our great leaders in this great state of Minnesota. I agree with you 100%. I'm so glad to be in the state of Minnesota during this most difficult time in our history. And I'm very, very proud to be part of this great state that is helping us and helping across the nation. Muy bien dicho, en Puerto Rico decimos que palo de mango más que hace mango. Entonces usted es un palo tremendo. Muchísimas gracias. You too, Commissioner.
I promise it was all good, Commissioner.
Well, listen, this has been a wonderful conversation. Senator Franson, thank you so very much for your voice, your words today, and your leadership every day in the community, your history, and I dare say your vision for inclusion and empowerment of our people. And, I think I can say this, that when you and I talk about, and I know this applies to Steve as well, change and inclusion, we're not talking about excluding anybody else. Our success doesn't depend on somebody else's failure. Winning for us means that we are in the winner's circle, and the circle we're creating is one that is universal, open, inclusive, and that the measure of success has to be that everybody, all of us, not at the expense of the other, but including the other, we bring the society, individuals, families forward. So thank you so much. And Commissioner, same with you. I want to invite you back as often as you are able to come, just to update the community. I think people need to hear what you have said, and what you said with clarity and with confidence, and it's inspiring. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Al. Thanks for having us both. It was a great conversation. And thank you for the public service you're doing by having these conversations. It's just critical to getting through this. So we're blessed in this state to have you and your team.
Great, thank you. Well, listen, that's it. If you're listening to this program and you like what we're doing, like it on YouTube and share it on Facebook. We're doing this every day, 7 days a week through the end of the year. We think it's important, and we thank you for being a part of it as well. Take care. Bye-bye.
Adios.